Hi. So just to finish off on the remnants of lecture one, we're going to talk a little bit now about research process or the research life cycle. What you should do when doing research and when you should do it over the course of a research project. The purpose of this really is to give you a structuring of what and when information are really important when you're starting off in research. What should I do next? So I suppose research generally starts by reading the relevant information or literature and finding relevant information. So once you've got your area of interest sorted, you want to read the relevant academic literature in that area and see what's been done, um, and read it very critically so that you see what hasn't been done, the gaps that have been left, or the errors. Maybe they've made an assumption that you don't agree with and that you'd like to test out. Look for inconsistencies. Maybe they report that 80 people is 100% of their sample, but then later on you notice that they report that 25% of people, 10 people, and that's an inconsistency. So that raises some questions. Also look at their future work, see what they've done. Um, then the idea in step 4 is to revisit this literature and evaluate it. So say, for example, you identify a gap, but you think, well, maybe someone else has done something about this. So then you'd look for other related literature, maybe literature the authors have published later on, particularly in the case of future work, to see if they have covered that gap that you've identified. And this iteration over these first 4 steps happens until you've cemented a fairly good research question, as in step 5 there. One that you're fairly sure the literature hasn't covered yet, or that's been inconsistently covered, or that hasn't been proven at sufficient strength. Now, in my case, that would result in writing a research proposal. Typically, this will be part of your dissertation. You'll identify a research question with your supervisor while reading literature that doesn't lead to a research proposal, that leads straight on to the next step, which is designing an approach that will address this gap. Uh, This can involve a lot of things. It can involve, for example, the building of a prototype software tool that shows that a certain approach is feasible. It can involve an empirical study where you test human participants for some attribute or the like. The classic example here from the health informatics domain is maybe testing some people for diabetes before and after treatment to see if the treatment helps them. And the first stage of this is designing the approach, making sure that your empirical study is fairly robust, transparent, systematic, that nothing you're doing is something that someone else could read critically and find gaps or flaws or errors in and attack your work. Once you've got this rigorous, robust design, then you try to carry out this work as planned, as designed, and you review the findings it generates. Did your prototype tool address this issue? Did it lay out a graph nicely? Did it provide a new novel interaction mechanism for users that they liked? Did the users in an empirical study find that interactive device useful? Did the treatment for diabetes result in better prognosis for diabetics? So after reviewing your findings, you probably get confidence of a certain degree and you publish them so that they can be peer reviewed. In your case, that'll probably be for a dissertation. But there are other mechanisms. So we publish in conferences, in journals. We even publish in posters. So posters are large A3 or A2 pieces of paper where we present a graphic image of our findings, and we stand beside these posters at conferences and talk to the people who come up and visit during the conference. Conference papers and journal papers are a bit more elaborate. They're a full textual description of our findings. And one of the reasons we do this is to get peer review, to see what other experts in the field think of these findings, to get suggestions for further work from these peers, to maybe think about, our own future work and what we plan to do and see if peers agree with it. But it's very important to note that this is only one research process. Yours could be very different. For example, a supervisor could say to you, look, I'm very interested in this research question specifically. Here's the literature you've got to read. So you go straight into identifying a research question, and with 5 or 6 seminal articles handed to you, then you try and expand those seminal articles to find more relevant literature, to maybe even refine the research question, maybe not, maybe to move straight on and design an approach that will address this gap. But maybe you find something in that, revisiting the literature that suggests that someone has done part of that research question, and you've got to refine your research question a little bit. So a nice example here might be scheduling systems for a clinic where people come into the health service and they, maybe a diabetic clinic, since we've used that example before, they come in and get their blood tested every few weeks. One of the big problems is that some people turn up, some people don't turn up, some people take more time than others. How can you best schedule a clinic which uses all your resources, your nurses, your consultants, to the best possible effect? So that might be something that you find interesting. So you might read up on the literature there, and you might find a number of algorithms that propose a really nice way of scheduling people so that nurses' time and consultants' time in particular is less wasted. Um, because these are the costs, the major costs in the health service. You might find that you give everyone 15 minutes, but you also have to take into account that 1 in 5 people probably won't turn up, and maybe that's the state of the art algorithm at the moment. But then you notice that sometimes these findings are quite accurate, the scheduling is quite accurate, but sometimes the empirical reports in the literature say they're way off. And you notice that this is typically in rural communities. So maybe you think, well, there might be a gap there in terms of the distance people have to travel. So you then try and figure out some sort of amendment to that algorithm. And if you're a software engineer, you might even develop a prototype system for that, to calculate based on participants or patients' distance from the clinic whether they will come or not. So there might be it might not be 4 out of 5 people as it is in the town, it might be 3 out of 5 people attend. And then you basically have identified a research question: does distance affect attendance at clinics? You might go back and read more literature now that you've identified some sort of research question and find that actually this has been done. But what hasn't been done is that it doesn't take into account public transport, whether people are on a public transport route or not. And all of a sudden you've read the literature exhaustively and you find that this has not been touched. So then you say, well, in my case, I'd write a research proposal. You'd probably go straight on to designing an approach that will address this gap. Some maybe retrospective look at the attendance in various different clinics in rural contexts, where you also have information on the transport to that hospital during the week, and of course the patient's addresses. So then you can get this information, you can identify that people on public transport links tend to get there 4 out of 5 times, people that don't tend to get there maybe 3 out of 5 times. You can use the data to see if that's actually true, carry out the work, review the findings, and usually get some, congruent findings, and that you'll probably find what you're expecting. But there's always going to be some tweaks, some anomalies that will actually prompt you to do further research work. Then, of course, you do your peer review. You maybe write an article for a journal, or maybe do a poster on your work and present it at a conference to get further feedback and further research direction. So, as I said, that's just one research process. There's lots of them, and one from the Saunders book that I like is this model, where you see there's a wish to do research, or in your case, an imposition to do research in terms of your dissertation. And when there's a wish or an imposition, then the first thing you probably want to do is formulate a topic area, not necessarily a research question, but a topic area that you'd like to work in. And that leads to some sort of critical review of the literature. Again, this idea of reading critically, not taking what the authors say for granted, but trying to explore it for errors, gaps, inconsistencies. Once you critically review, you'll probably end up iterating back up, where you formulate your topic a bit more concisely until eventually you get to the stage where you've actually got a specific research question. That again leads to a bit of a critical review to check that it hasn't been done before. And maybe iterate a few more times to change that and refine that. Then you have to do the stage called understanding the philosophy. So it's true that certain research questions demand a certain approach, other research questions demand another approach. And we're going to look a bit at the different philosophies that you can bring to research, and when they're appropriate and when they're not appropriate, because you want to do the right type of research for your research question. Once you understand your philosophy, you can design the empirical study or the approach appropriately. But noting that all the time you can iterate back when things aren't working out, to go back to an earlier stage to maybe change your research question, the literature reviewed, the philosophy and the design. Once you've got your design, of course, you have to address the ethical concerns. If you're gathering data about people, there's always an ethical concern that that data might be misused to the person's detriment, and of course that the college could be sued. So you've got to address those ethical issues before you'd be allowed to proceed, particularly in the health informatic context, but also in the software engineering context, because any information about people is potentially dangerous. Then you start, once you've designed and the ethical issues addressed, you can actually start gathering the data to get the information you need to answer your research question. And do the data analysis, statistics perhaps, or maybe something called qualitative analysis, where you analyze sentences, paragraphs, diagrams even, and write up your findings, which may, and sometimes have, even in my own experience, resulted in a slight change of the research question, because you find out you've actually answered something that's slightly different. So you don't actually necessarily report on this temporarily, what you did all the time. You report on it in a way that makes a cohesive whole for the reader, something easier to read. Once you've written the report, you submit and give a presentation on that, and of course in your case that will result in a dissertation mark. So with these visions of the software life cycle, I just want to point out that our research methods course is going to be a bit different from the other research methods courses that are out there. In a traditional research methods course, they talk about forming a research question, carrying out the research design, and then carrying out the research itself and getting your findings. Ours is going to be a bit wider. We're going to focus on reading the literature towards forming the research question, and forming the research question as well, but reading the literature primarily, because that's where the majority of research questions come from. And if they don't come from there directly, you tend to have to consult the literature back to refine your research question before you end up with your ultimate research question. So we're going to focus on reading the literature, forming the research question. We're also going to look at the philosophy. As I mentioned before, this is important to carry out the research appropriately, to design the research appropriately. So that's very important. It underpins research design, so we're also going to look at that. Research carried out and reporting on it, because reporting on it is hugely important. And that sort of table of contents means that the vision I have of research is much more messy than the linear type guidelines we've given before, the linear type processes we've gone before. I think there are two core aims in research. There's the derivation of a position or theory towards the start, and the evaluation of that position and theory over time as the research goes on. And that can lead to maybe even a new theory back here, so a derivation of a modified or new theory back here. They're the two core foundations or pillars of research, and how they are done is covered by this box in the middle. So, say for example, you've derived an initial theory, and you read some more and you find, well, that theory doesn't quite hold, I'll have to change it slightly. So reading feeds back into the derivation of position or theory, which then feeds back into the material you'll read. You might read different material because you've now a new or modified theory. Likewise, when you carry out empirical studies, like I said in the previous slide, you'll find some that come in exactly as you would expect them, but the majority produce some surprising findings. So that results in maybe the derivation of a modified theory or position. Writing, very important in deriving your position or theory, because there's nothing as clarifying for the mind as having to write something down on black and white. And when, of course, you've written it, it'll be peer reviewed, so that could cause you to change your theory as well. That writing and that peer reviewing, of course, is also more associated with evaluation of the position and theory, because you do the empirical studies to evaluate the position or theory, you write them up, but as you do that, you all evaluate the position or theory, but of course that evaluation might result in not quite true. We need to change our position or theory, so we derive a new position or theory. Benchmarking is just a subset of empirical studies, comparing it to other approaches, and that can refine your idea of your theory or position. Reflection, just sitting down and thinking about what you've done and, you know, strange findings that you've got. Design research is this designing a system and seeing if it can do what you think it should be able to do, and then iteratively refining it over time as you find out it typically doesn't do quite what you want it to do, but there are other ways that you might get it to do what you want it to do. I think what I really like about this slide is the fact that it, or the scheme of research, is that it focuses on the theory, the central thesis. So for example, when you're doing a PhD, you do a PhD thesis. People think that thesis refers to the book. It actually refers to the position or the theory the position you've adopted, something that you can stand over. You've got some statement that you believe in, and you've got evidence to back up that position after 4 years. And so this thesis, the derivation of it and the evaluation of it are the central tenets, and here are a number of things you do towards the derivation and evaluation of that thesis. So I think that's probably the best scheme. Okay, the next segment's going to look at the articles for the HIS people. We're going to look at that HIS article, and for the software engineering people, we're going to look at a program oralization approach. Please only read the part of the lecture that's appropriate for you. The HIS part of the paper review is very clearly marked for that. The software engineering paper is very clearly marked as that. So don't read both. Okay, cheers.